American cop punches Korean man at airport, not knowing it was Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The JFK International Airport hummed with the usual symphony of hurried footsteps, flight announcements, and the muffled conversations of weary travelers. Officer Rick Davidson, a seasoned cop working airport security, stood with arms crossed near Gate 23, his keen eyes scanning the sea of faces. The morning had been uneventful, just the occasional passport mishap or an overpacked suitcase. He sighed, adjusting his belt as he noticed a small commotion by the security checkpoint. A man in an oversized black trench coat and thick sunglasses was arguing with TSA officers in hushed but agitated tones. Rick's instincts immediately kicked in. He had seen enough suspicious behavior in his years to know when something felt off. His pulse quickened as he took a step forward. "Sir, step aside for additional screening," one of the TSA officers demanded, their voices tightening with authority. The man grumbled in what sounded like Korean, his face partially obscured by his large sunglasses. He was flanked by two other men in identical dark suits, their expressions cold and unreadable. Rick narrowed his eyes. Something about the scene sent warning signals through his gut. There was an unspoken tension, as if the air had thickened around them. The airport had been on high alert for weeks due to increasing global tensions, and an uncooperative, heavily guarded man was never a good sign. As the officers attempted to guide him aside, the man resisted, shoving one of them back slightly. Rick had seen enough. Years of training had drilled into him that hesitation could mean disaster. With a swift motion, he stepped forward, gripping the man's arm firmly. "Step back now," he barked, his patience wearing thin. But instead of complying, the man yanked his arm away with surprising strength. In a flash, Rick's instincts took over. His right fist shot out, landing a solid punch against the man's jaw. The force sent him stumbling back, knocking his sunglasses to the ground. A sharp gasp rippled through the terminal as the air seemed to freeze. The two men in suits reacted instantly, their hands twitching toward their jackets as if reaching for weapons. Rick's hand hovered over his own holster, his mind racing. Had he just punched someone important? The fallen sunglasses skidded across the polished floor, revealing the man's face to the stunned onlookers. Silence hung heavy in the air before a horrified murmur swept through the crowd like wildfire. "Oh my God," someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the sudden hush. Rick blinked, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The man sprawled before him, now rubbing his bruised jaw with a scowl, was someone he had only ever seen on the news. His distinct round face, slicked back hair, and unmistakable features confirmed the impossible truth. The man he had just punched was Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. The realization hit Rick like a freight train, his stomach twisting into knots. His pulse roared in his ears as his mind screamed, "What the hell have I just done?" The terminal remained eerily silent for a split second before an explosion of chaos erupted. Gasps turned into panicked whispers, and then outright shouting as passengers scrambled to process the impossible scene unfolding before them. Rick's chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, his brain still lagging behind reality. The two men in black suits, who had stood like statues a moment before, moved simultaneously, closing the distance between them and Kim Jong-un in the blink of an eye. One of them dropped to a knee, checking on their leader, while the other locked eyes with Rick, his expression unreadable but deadly serious. Rick felt his fingers twitch over his holstered weapon, but he didn't dare make another move. He had faced armed suspects, drug dealers, and airport threats before, but this was something else. His body screamed at him to do something, but his mind was caught in a whirlwind of disbelief. What was the North Korean leader doing here? No public announcements, no diplomatic escort, just him and his security walking through JFK like any other traveler. The pieces didn't fit. Kim Jong-un groaned, touching his jaw, then slowly lifted his gaze to Rick. His dark eyes were sharp, filled not with rage, but with an unsettling amusement. He let out a slow, measured exhale before speaking in near-perfect English, his voice eerily calm. "Do you have any idea what you just done?" Rick's mouth went dry. The words felt like a ticking bomb. Every second that passed increased the weight of his mistake. He tried to answer, to explain himself, but before he could, the radios clipped to the belts of every security officer in the area crackled to life with frantic voices. "Unit 7, respond. What the hell just happened? This is dispatch. Why is there a diplomatic incident at Gate 23? Get the FBI, the State Department. Get someone on this now." More security personnel rushed toward them, their hands hovering cautiously over their weapons, unsure of what the correct response should be. One wrong move, one misstep, and this could turn into an international disaster. Rick felt the weight of 100 eyes burning into him. He was the man who had just thrown a punch that could change global history. The air in the terminal was suffocating, thick with unspoken threats and barely contained panic. Rick's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the weight of his actions settled like a concrete block in his chest. Kim Jong-un slowly stood, brushing off his dark trench coat, his fingers flexing as if testing his jaw for fractures. His two bodyguards flanked him instantly, their cold, calculating eyes scanning the growing crowd, their movements so synchronized it was unsettling. Rick swallowed hard, his instincts warring with his training. He had been taught to act first and ask questions later in high-risk situations, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. He had just punched the most controversial world leader alive, and there was no protocol for that. He forced himself to speak, though his throat felt dry as sandpaper. "Sir, he started, but before he could utter another word, the deafening sound of military boots slamming against the marble floor cut through the tension. A squad of FBI agents and airport SWAT officers stormed the terminal, weapons raised but fingers tense on the triggers. "Everyone, stand down," one of the agents barked, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A tall man in a dark suit, his slicked back hair giving him an air of absolute authority, pushed through the crowd. His eyes locked on a Kim Jong-un, then flicked toward Rick, and something in his face twisted between disbelief and fury. "Jesus Christ, Davidson. What the hell have you done?" Rick recognized the man instantly, Special Agent Matthew Cole, a high-ranking FBI liaison for international affairs. Cole's reputation was legendary, but at this moment, he looked like he wanted to strangle Rick with his bare hands. Before Rick could answer, Kim Jong-un let out a low chuckle. The sound was unexpected, almost casual, but laced with something sinister. His lips curled into the faintest smirk as he turned to Cole. "I do hope the United States does not make a habit of welcoming foreign leaders in this manner," Kim said, his tone disturbingly amused. He tilted his head slightly, rubbing his jaw. "Your officer here seems a little enthusiastic." A bead of sweat rolled down Rick's temple. The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced with a blade. Cole's nostrils flared. He stepped between Rick and Kim, lowering his voice but keeping his body language sharp. "Mr. Chairman, I assure you this was a misunderstanding. We had no knowledge of your arrival. There was no diplomatic notice, no security briefing." Kim interrupted smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his coat. "That is because I did not want one." Cole blinked. The words sank in, and for a moment, even he seemed unsure of how to proceed. "You came here unannounced?" Kim smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent an unsettling chill down Rick's spine. "Let's just say, I wanted to see how your country truly operates when it doesn't expect to be watched." He cast a sidelong glance at Rick, his amusement deepening. "And I must say, I have been quite entertained." Rick felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a diplomatic crisis. It was a test. The weight of Kim Jong-un's words settled over the terminal like a death sentence. Every official within earshot visibly tensed, their expressions shifting from controlled panic to absolute horror. This wasn't just an accidental diplomatic incident. This was a calculated maneuver, a move designed to test American security, to expose vulnerabilities, and Rick had walked right into it. Special Agent Cole's jaw clenched so tightly Rick swore he heard his teeth grind. He turned to Rick, his voice barely more than a whisper, but seething with restrained fury. Not another damn word, Davidson. You've done enough. Rick felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. His instincts screamed at him to defend himself. He was just doing his job. But what argument could he make? He had thrown a punch that could spark an international catastrophe. He forced himself to breathe through his nose, knowing that whatever came next would decide his fate. Kim Jong took a deliberate step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The chaos of the airport seemed to fade into the background as the North Korean leader studied Rick with an expression that was neither anger nor fear, but pure curiosity. "Tell me, Officer Davidson," he mused, his voice dangerously smooth. "What was it that made you strike me? Was it my reluctance to comply? Or do you simply have a habit of using force before asking questions?" Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His response could either defuse the situation or make it exponentially worse. He squared his shoulders, refusing to shrink under the weight of the moment. "I was protecting this airport, Mr. Chairman. Your actions were suspicious, and I reacted accordingly." A flicker of amusement crossed Kim's face. "Suspicious." He allowed a soft chuckle. "Ah, so that's what they call it these days." His eyes gleamed as he turned back to Cole. "I do hope your government does not share this man's enthusiasm. Otherwise, I may have to reconsider my presence here." Cole stiffened, his diplomatic instincts kicking in. "Mr. Chairman, I assure you, this was an isolated incident. Officer Davidson's actions were a misunderstanding, and I take full responsibility for ensuring your visit continues without further interruptions." Kim smirked, clearly enjoying the sheer discomfort radiating off the American officials. A misunderstanding. He let the words roll over his tongue before nodding. "I see." Then, in a deliberate move, he extended his hand toward Rick. A hush fell over the surrounding officers. Cole's breath hitched. The security teams, both American and North Korean, seemed to shift in unison, their fingers twitching over their weapons, as if expecting something, anything, to go horribly wrong. Rick hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was a trap, a power play that could spin in any direction. But to refuse? That would be even worse. He inhaled sharply, then reached out, gripping Kim Jong-un's hand. The North Korean leader's fingers were shockingly firm, not the weak, passive grip Rick had expected. As they shook hands, Kim leaned in just enough for his voice to reach Rick's ears alone. "Let's see how long it takes before your government decides what to do with you." Rick felt a cold chill creep down his spine. This wasn't just a handshake. It was a warning. Rick felt the weight of Kim Jong-un's words settle in his chest like a cinder block. As their handshake broke, the North Korean leader's smirk never wavered, his amusement palpable. Every eye in the terminal was locked onto them, a mix of disbelief, fear, and barely concealed panic flashing across the faces of officials and security personnel alike. Cole didn't waste a second. He grabbed Rick's arm in a vice-like grip and pulled him aside, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he hissed, his voice low enough to keep the already panicked crowd from hearing. Rick clenched his jaw. He wasn't some rookie who had lost control. He had reacted. But now, it didn't matter whether he was right or wrong. All that mattered was how Washington would spin this. Before he could respond, a senior State Department official stormed into the scene, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. Margaret Holloway, a woman known for her ice-cold diplomacy, barely spared Rick a glance before turning her full attention to Kim. "Mr. Chairman," she began smoothly, her voice a carefully practiced mixture of deference and authority. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. The United States values diplomatic relations, and we are prepared to ensure that this incident does not escalate any further." Kim Jong tilted his head, pretending to consider her words. He was enjoying this, every second of it. This wasn't just an international scandal. This was leverage, and he knew it. He murmured, his fingers brushing his jaw where Rick's punch had landed. "Ensure? And how do you intend to do that, Ms. Holloway?" Margaret didn't blink. "We are prepared to discuss terms that will guarantee your satisfaction." Rick's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. They were going to sacrifice him, Kim let out a small chuckle, his gaze flicking back to Rick. You hear that, officer? Your government is eager to make things right. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Rick and Cole could hear. The question is, what are you willing to lose? Rick felt his pulse hammering in his skull. He had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. He was staring into the eyes of a man who controlled an entire nation's fate, a leader who didn't think twice about playing chess with human lives. And now, Rick was just another piece on the board. Rick felt the pressure mounting like an avalanche. The way Kim Jong-un looked at him wasn't out of anger. It was out of amusement. He was playing a game that Rick had unknowingly walked into. And now, the United States was scrambling to figure out how to clean up the mess before it turned into a full-blown international disaster. Margaret Holloway kept her expression as composed as ever, but Rick could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't just an official. She was a fixer. Her job wasn't to determine who was right or wrong. It was to contain the fallout at all costs. Mr. Chairman, she said with her usual diplomatic coolness, I assure you that every necessary measure will be taken to ensure this situation is resolved to your satisfaction. Kim smirked, as if he had expected that answer. Ah, but what exactly does necessary measures mean, Ms. Holloway? He looked directly at Rick, his gaze sharp and calculating. Will this officer be punished? Publicly, perhaps. A gesture of goodwill. Rick felt his blood run cold. There it was, the sacrifice. The easiest way to appease Kim was to throw Rick under the bus. Cole stiffened beside him, his jaw clenched tight. We don't negotiate personnel matters with foreign leaders, he bit out, his voice dangerously low. Kim chuckled. Is that so? Because it seems to me that your government is eager to make this go away. He tilted his head slightly. I wonder, how valuable is this officer to you? Rick could see it now, the way Washington would spin this. If they admitted that a high-ranking officer had assaulted a world leader, it would be a public relations disaster. If they refused to acknowledge it, North Korea could use the event to paint the U.S. as reckless aggressors. Either way, this wasn't about Rick anymore. This was political warfare. Margaret kept her expression unreadable, but Rick could feel the walls closing in. She wasn't here to defend him. She was here to neutralize the threat, even if that meant making him the scapegoat. Kim Jong-un's smirk deepened. Tell me, Officer Davidson, do you think your country will stand by you? Rick didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. Rick's stomach churned with unease. He had served his country for years, upheld the law, and risked his life to protect civilians. But now, none of that mattered. He wasn't a decorated officer anymore. He wasn't even a man in uniform. He was a liability, a problem Washington needed to fix before the wrong people got involved. Kim Jong-un knew it, too. His smirk never faded as he watched Rick, as if he were already 10 steps ahead in this twisted game. His bodyguards remained still, their faces unreadable, but their presence alone was a silent reminder. One wrong move, and this could spiral into something far worse. Margaret Holloway inhaled sharply, regaining control of the conversation. Mr. Chairman, she began, her voice measured, the United States is prepared to issue a formal statement on this matter, acknowledging the misunderstanding and taking appropriate actions. However, I assume you're looking for something more. Kim's gaze flicked to her, his smirk widening ever so slightly. Ah, now we are speaking the same language. He took a calculated pause, letting the tension stretch like a drawn bowstring. I believe a public apology is in order. Not from your government, not from your security forces, but from your officer here. His eyes locked on Rick. On camera, Rick felt his pulse spike. A public apology? That would be an admission of guilt. It wouldn't just humiliate him. It would destroy his career. The moment that footage was broadcasted, he'd be finished. Labeled a disgrace. A reckless officer who couldn't control his impulses. Cole stepped in, his voice sharp. That's not going to happen. Kim simply raised an eyebrow, amused by the resistance. No. He folded his hands behind his back, shifting slightly. I wonder, then should I make a call to my allies? Perhaps a statement about the United States' aggressive treatment of foreign dignitaries. His tone was mockingly casual, but the threat was clear. Margaret's expression didn't falter, But Rick saw the hesitation in her eyes. The worst-case scenario was inching closer. If Kim publicly condemned the incident, the repercussions would be unpredictable. Tensions were already high between North Korea and the U.S. A single, well-placed narrative could ignite an international firestorm. Rick clenched his fist, his mind racing. He had acted on instinct. He had done what any officer would have done in the face of suspicious behavior. And now, he was supposed to grovel? Kim took another step closer, his voice almost a whisper. So, officer, are you ready to prove your loyalty? Or will your government prove that you are expendable? Rick's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure which was worse. Rick felt trapped. The cold, sterile walls of JFK Airport seemed to close in around him. The weight of Kim Jong-un's words pressed against his chest, each syllable a well-placed dagger. The North Korean leader had maneuvered him into a corner, dangling the fate of international relations over his head like a guillotine. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down, not just for him, but for the entire country. Margaret Holloway remained composed, her diplomatic mask firmly in place, but Rick could see the gears turning in her mind. She was calculating the risk, measuring the costs. Would it be easier to sacrifice Rick's reputation than to navigate a global crisis? Cole, however, wasn't having it. His stance was rigid, his glare locked onto Kim. We don't bow to blackmail. His words were laced with defiance, but even he knew how precarious the situation had become. Kim chuckled softly, as if this were all a game to him. Oh, Agent Cole, he mused, it is not blackmail. It is simply persuasion. His gaze flicked back to Rick. I do not need to lift a finger for your own country to turn on you. The media will eat this story alive. Your government will denounce you to save face. You will be the face of American recklessness. And all because you could not control your temper. Rick's breath hitched. He knew Kim was right. The moment this went public, the narrative would spiral out of his control. He would go from being a respected officer to a symbol of international disgrace. The backlash would be swift, merciless. Margaret stepped forward, her tone neutral but firm. Mr. Chairman, an apology on live television is not something we can guarantee. Kim let out a thoughtful hum, tapping his fingers against his chin. Then, perhaps, he trailed off, his gaze lingering on Rick before turning to Margaret. If an apology is too difficult, I believe we can negotiate an alternative. Cole stiffened. What kind of alternative? Kim's smirk deepened. Officer Davidson will not be fired. That would be too obvious. Instead, he will be removed from field duty, placed under internal review, and quietly phased out of his position. Rick felt a wave of fury surge through him. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. They wanted to erase him. Not with a public execution, not with an immediate firing, but with a slow, methodical elimination. A quiet disgrace. Cole's face darkened. That's not your call to make. Kim shrugged. No, but it will be your government's. He smiled knowingly. I am simply expediting the process. Rick's pulse pounded in his skull. He had trained for years, dedicated his life to law enforcement, only to be discarded like an afterthought. His entire career, his identity, was about to be stripped away, not because he had done something truly wrong, but because it was the easiest solution. And the worst part? There wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Rick felt his world slipping away. The people he had trusted, the government he had served, were negotiating his downfall in real time. Margaret Holloway wasn't fighting for him. She was managing damage control. Cole, for all his defiance, knew this battle was already half lost. Kim Jong-un knew it too. He stood with the ease of a man who had already won, watching the American officials scramble for a response. His demands weren't about justice or even revenge. They were about power. He was demonstrating that he could walk into the heart of America and bend the system to his will. Rick's fists clenched. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to tell them all to go to hell. But his rational side knew better. A single outburst would confirm everything Kim was saying, that he was reckless, a loose cannon, a liability. They wanted him to break. So he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and did the only thing he could. He leveled the playing field. Mr. Chairman, Rick said, his voice steady, You assume my government is eager to get rid of me. That might be true, but what about you? A flicker of amusement crossed Kim's face. Oh, and what do you mean by that, officer? Rick held his gaze. If I made an example of this story doesn't die, it explodes. You'll get your moment, but what happens next? What happens when people start asking why the North Korean leader was walking through an American airport alone, unannounced, with no official delegation? Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Cole remained silent, but watchful. Kim smirked and faltered, but Rick could tell he had hit something. The world will wonder what you were doing here, Rick pressed on. Your enemies, inside and outside your country, will see vulnerability. If you were truly in control, this wouldn't have happened. A global spectacle like this, it doesn't make you look powerful. It makes you look careless. For the first time since the incident began, Kim's amusement faded. Rick took a step closer, keeping his voice even. You can push for my downfall, and maybe you'll get it. But at what cost? The longer this plays out, the more questions will arise. You don't want scrutiny, Mr. Chairman. You want silence. A long silence stretched between them. Then, something changed. Kim let out a slow breath, studying Rick with a newfound interest. He glanced at Margaret and Cole, then at his bodyguards. Finally, he smiled. A real smile, one of acknowledgement. Interesting, he murmured. Then, turning to Margaret, he waved a hand dismissively. I believe I've had enough fun. Consider this incident resolved. Margaret exhaled discreetly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. We appreciate your understanding, Mr. Chairman. Kim turned back to Rick. You are not what I expected. His eyes gleamed with something close to respect. Do be careful, officer. Not everyone will appreciate your ability to think beyond orders. With that, he gestured to his guards and walked away, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. Rick didn't move. He barely even breathed. Margaret turned to him, her voice low but sharp. Do you have any idea how close you came to losing everything? Rick looked at her, then at Cole. I think, he said quietly, I just saved us all. Rick stood frozen as Kim Jong disappeared down the terminal, flanked by his silent bodyguards. The North Korean leader had left without another word, but the shockwave of his presence still lingered in the air. Conversations whispered among security personnel. Eyes darted toward Rick as if waiting for some final verdict. The tension had not disappeared. It had simply shifted. Margaret Holloway was the first to speak. She turned to Rick, her tone measured but unmistakably sharp. Officer Davidson, you have no idea how dangerously close we came to an international crisis today. Rick exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. No disrespect, ma'am, but I think we both know that if I hadn't called his bluff, this would have ended a lot worse. Cole smirked slightly, but he quickly masked it when Margaret shot him a look. Bluff or not, she countered, this isn't over. The administration will have to address this, and you're still at the center of it. Expect inquiries. A lot of them. Rick expected nothing less. He had defused the immediate crisis, but the political storm had just begun. The media would get wind of this, and when they did, the headlines would tear through the country like wildfire. Cole finally stepped forward. So what happens now? Margaret pressed her lips together in thought. I need to speak with Washington. Damage control will be priority one. She then turned back to Rick. You will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Rick's stomach twisted. Even after everything, they were still sidelining him. I did my job, he said, his voice dangerously close to defiance. You did, Margaret admitted. But this isn't about right or wrong anymore, Davidson. It's about optics. The world saw you strike a foreign leader, and whether we like it or not, that means consequences. Rick inhaled sharply, forcing himself to swallow his pride. He wanted to argue, to fight, but deep down, he knew this wasn't a battle he could win. Cole placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You did good today, Rick. You saved our asses. But this is the game now. You need to let them play it. Rick glanced at the swarm of security still surrounding them, at the reporters already sniffing for a story near the edges of the terminal. He felt the exhaustion seep into his bones. Fine, he said finally, but I'm not going to let them bury me. Margaret gave him a knowing look. That remains to be seen. With that, She turned and walked away, her phone already in hand, no doubt making the first of many calls to Washington. Rick exhaled and turned to Cole. How bad do you think this is going to get? Cole let out a dry chuckle. Bad? Rick, you just punched Kim Jong-un in an American airport. This story isn't going away anytime soon. Rick sighed. Yeah, he figured as much. Rick barely had time to process what had just happened before the storm hit. Within hours, the incident had leaked. The first whispers started on social media, grainy cell phone footage, half-formed rumors. But it didn't take long for the media machine to latch on. By the time Rick left the airport under quiet escort, his name was everywhere. Breaking news: American cop assaults North Korean leader at JFK Airport. Diplomatic disaster? How one officer may have sparked an international crisis. Hero or hazard? The controversial officer who punched Kim Jong-un. Rick sat in his small apartment, the glow of the television illuminating his exhausted face. Every channel played the same footage. Him throwing the punch, the shock on Kim's face, the immediate chaos that followed. The narrative spun in every possible direction. Some painted him as an irresponsible hothead, a cop too eager to use force. Others hailed him as a symbol of defiance, the man who had done what many had only dreamed of. The public was divided. Half the country wanted to see him fired. The other half wanted to buy him a beer. Rick rubbed his temples, trying to block out the noise. None of this should have happened. He had reacted in the moment, relying on training and instinct. He hadn't been trying to make a statement. But now his name was a political weapon, a headline, a talking point. His phone buzzed. It was Cole. Turn on CNN. Now. Rick grabbed the remote and flipped the channel. His stomach clenched as he saw Margaret Holloway at the White House press podium, flanked by stern-faced officials. The country was about to get its official response. The United States deeply regrets the misunderstanding that occurred earlier today at JFK International Airport, Margaret said, her voice smooth, controlled. Officer Rick Davidson has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. We have been in communication with North Korean officials, and we will ensure that diplomatic relations remain stable despite this unfortunate event. Rick closed his eyes. There it was, the official spin. He was being hung out to dry, not fired outright, but sidelined, his career dangling by a thread while Washington cleaned up the mess. His phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Cole. Meet me. Now. We need to talk. Rick grabbed his jacket. If the government wanted to erase him, they were about to find out just how hard he could fight back. Rick drove through the city, his mind racing. The media had turned him into a national spectacle. Washington was hanging him out to dry, and the man he had punched, Kim Jong-un himself, was likely watching this unfold with amusement. But Rick wasn't going down without a fight. He pulled into a dimly lit parking lot, spotting Cole leaning against his black SUV. The senior agent's expression was unreadable, but Rick could tell he had been watching the chaos unfold just like everyone else. This is bad, Cole said the moment Rick stepped out of his car. They're going to bury you, Rick. Quietly, subtly. They'll make it seem like you resigned, or that you were reassigned to some desk job until you fade into obscurity. Rick exhaled sharply. I figured as much. So what's the play here? Cole smirked slightly. That depends. Do you want to disappear? Or do you want to fight? Rick's jaw tightened. He had served his country for years, risked his life to uphold the law. He wasn't about to let political convenience decide his fate. I fight. Cole nodded, almost as if he had expected the answer. Good, because the way I see it, you still have leverage. The public is split. The media is tearing itself apart trying to decide whether you're a villain or a hero. And if you play this right, you can control the narrative. Rick narrowed his eyes. What are you suggesting? Cole handed him a burner phone. You need to get ahead of this. Tell your side of the story. Do an exclusive interview. Someone big, someone neutral. Tell the world exactly what happened, why you reacted the way you did, and make it clear that you were just doing your job. Rick hesitated. Won't that piss off Washington even more? Cole let out a dry chuckle. Oh, it'll piss off a lot of people. But if you don't take control of this now, they'll turn you into the villain. You can't let them dictate the story. Rick clenched the burner phone in his fist, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He had spent his life following orders, upholding the rules. But now, the system he had sworn to protect was trying to erase him for the sake of diplomacy. No, he wouldn't let that happen. Rick looked up at Cole, a newfound determination burning in his eyes. Set it up. Let's see how Washington likes it when they can't control the narrative. Cole smirked. That's the spirit. Rick took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if the government thought he was going to fade into silence, they were about to find out just how loud he could be. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let US know if the story of justice moved you.